when you get stopped by the police, I think their words were, turn your dome lights on so the cop can see in the car. At least he won't be afraid because he can't see. Be respectful. Do what they say, no matter how demeaning it is, no matter how bad they treat you, no matter what names they call you. Eat it and just take it. Your job is to just make sure you come home. And then our job will be to, deal with anything that happened that wasn't supposed to happen. But your goal is to make it home safely. And so it was basically eat the shit that we know you're going to get from police officers. Just come home.
That was Congressman Cedric Richmond, a Louisiana Democrat and former chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, recalling what his parents told him at a young age about what to do when he encountered the police. I'm joined today by my CQ Roll Call colleague Clyde McGrady, who talked with Richmond and two other members of Congress, Republican Will Hurd of Texas and Democrat Andre Carson of Indiana, about their similar experiences and some of their own interactions with police as black men, both when they were younger and even as congressmen. Clyde, welcome to Political Theater.
Thanks for having me, man. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, let's start with Richmond. He got let us off at the top of the hour, though, but he also, like in your interview, which we're going to play a clip of in a second here, he talks about being home, being a younger man, and kind of getting a talk from a black police officer. Let's listen to that clip.
One of the incidents I remember most clearly was being stopped by African American. I was on St. Charles Avenue in a predominantly white neighborhood, very upscale. I mean, it is DeAb in New Orleans. I forgot why he pulled me over, but it was an African American cop. I was polite, and he asked me for my license, and I couldn't find it. It was my freshman year in college. I was home for break driving my mother's car, and then he went back, ran my name and all of that. And then he came back to the car and said, look, I see the Morehouse sticker on the back of your car. Do you go to Morehouse? I said, I do. He said, well, Dr. King once said that the man can't ride your back if your back's not bent. And he said, you do realize right now that I could ride your back if I wanted to because you don't have your license. But I'd rather make this a teachable moment. He told me to go home and said if I was coming back out or going anywhere else, I needed to make sure I had my license on me. And so that was something I never forgot.
Cedric Richmond has been in the news a little bit lately. There was a markup of a police reform bill in the Judiciary Committee a little ways back, and he got into it with Matt Gaetz, a Republican congressman from Florida, about the kind of this fear that he has for his own son, and it you can almost hear it in that clip. That he, this is something that he obviously remembers very vividly.
He has a 6-year-old son that he has yet to give the talk to, but he did quote this meme, that's floating out there, that says, it's a picture of a young black boy, and it says, when did I go from cute to being a threat? And it does speak to this fear that a lot of parents have. And he considers himself fortunate in that interaction that he had with a black police officer in New Orleans when he was younger, because he didn't have his license. And this cop kind of cut him a break by letting him know, if I wanted to, I would have cause to be a little bit rougher with you, I guess, or a little bit tougher with you. But he really gave him some, tough love, tried to scare him a little bit, because it also speaks to this notion that a lot of black parents instill in their kid, that you have to be better, right? You have to be twice as good.
Twice as good, yeah.
Twice as good. Your margins are just slimmer. Your margins for error are just slimmer. You can't do the same things that your white friends do. It's your errors will not be written off as a youthful indiscretion, as or boys will be boys the way they are with some kids.
And what's also just remarkable about that interaction is that Richmond's from the New Orleans area.
Mm-hmm.
New Orleans has a somewhat rough, racial past. They took down Confederate statues a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
They were a little bit ahead of the curve in getting rid of Jeff Davis and Robert E. Lee statues. But the police department has this incredibly checkered history, particularly when it comes to race in New Orleans. And here's a black cop almost assuming this privilege of saying, I could take you in, or I could do this just because I'm a cop. And it's great that he had he assumed that, like, I'm gonna help you out. But it's also just this weird thing of, like, it speaks to some of the tension, I think, that, like, it's not like, New Orleans had this, like, pristine, police department. They were,
Right.
they've been under federal review for years, in different times. And it was just remarkable. I mean, and it's obviously still painful for Richmond in a way too.
Yeah, there's also some interesting class stuff going on there. Like I mentioned in the story, the talk cuts across class, whether you're upper middle class kid, poor kid, middle class kid. But Richmond noted something very interesting in that story, is that he had a Morehouse sticker on his car, which is one of the most prestigious historically black colleges in the country. I mean, Martin Luther King went there, and in fact, the officer quotes Martin Luther King when he's talking to Richmond. But I wonder if that Morehouse sticker wasn't there, how that interaction would have gone, though. That's kind of what's
Richmond
unspoken there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Richmond was not, from the hood,
Right.
like, and this wasn't taking place in, like, the Ninth Ward, down in New Orleans. This was, like, I mean, Richmond, by his own account, says that he grew up, like, middle class, upper middle class,
Mm-hmm.
went to private schools, had all the sort of the privileges that affords, and he's still, even with the Morehouse sticker, like you said, he's still getting hassled by a black cop, no less. I mean, it's just,
I wonder,
it's remarkable.
Had that cop not been black and understood the class dynamics at play, like, oh, this is a Morehouse kid. Again, I wonder how that interaction would have gone.
Yeah. Let's pivot to talking about Will Hurd. He's a Republican from Texas. He has decided to retire at the end of this term, but he quickly kind of made himself a reputation as being somebody willing to work across the aisle.
Mm-hmm.
He's a former CIA undercover officer.
Mm-hmm.
He worked in the Middle East, among other stations. He also owned his own business, and is from the San Antonio area. Let's listen to this clip of him talking about being pulled over with one of his white staffers.
I was with a staffer when we're in Far West Texas late at night. We're driving and we get pulled over. And I was like, hey, stop moving. Put your hands on the dash, right? Like, and they were kind of like, what? Like, they just acted like it was, not a big deal. It was just a routine thing. I had to talk through it with them and explain it. And then some of the folks on my staff was like, you do know how different that is from what many of us have experienced.
There you go. I mean, again, like, this is a guy who's been in harm's way. He's used to living with anxiety. Like, when you're working undercover for the Central Intelligence Agency abroad, it doesn't matter if it's, like, England, or like, a place that where it might be potentially more hostile. He probably has more training in dealing with anxiety than most of us, and dealing with this kind of stuff. And yet he was obviously afraid. He went right back to the training of, like, no sudden movements, like, ask permission to do anything, hands up. And the white staffer is just like, what?
Yeah. What's notable about Hurd is that he is the only African-American Republican in the House, but he is retiring. So he's definitely been a leader in speaking out about this issue within his party. But yeah, his background as a CIA officer is interesting, because I talked to him about this for another story, and he said, he's been in some sticky situations, trying to gather intelligence in these, massive mobs. And I think he was stationed in Pakistan, I believe. But even with that and all that danger, he's still his instinct, that that talk that he got as a child, I mean, it just never leaves. He's a grown man and he gets pulled over and he knows, all right, hands on, keep your hands visible, no sudden movements. And he has this young white staffer who just was not given the same instructions, and it's kind of just like, well, okay, what? Like nothing.
Why would we be afraid of the police?
Why would the officer is not? He's he's here to help. He's officer friendly. I'm sure that's been his interaction.
And I mean, it is interesting, like the class, kind of issue that you brought up with Richmond. I mean, some of that might, like apply, in a place like, given the benefit of the doubt to this officer, right? Or just the, the situation that I, growing up myself in a rural area, I encountered a number of police officers who were not the nicest people in the world. And I also was well aware of the firearm component of this, and that nobody likes sudden movements when you pull somebody over. And, the times that it's remarkable hearing, because I never heard anything like the talk, from my parents, but just knowing, that like my own kind of uneasiness about being, pulled over in parts of the country, like Cottonwood, Arizona. It's a little nerve wracking for me. So it just, to me, like the fact that his staffer was still, and I'm not trying to pick on the guy, we're not giving the name or anything, but the fact that he didn't get it, and that he had to see, and how weird it must have been for Heard also to be in that vulnerable kind of position around somebody who he employs.
Yeah, and Heard is mentioned, like, since he wrote an op-ed where he mentions getting to talk pretty recently, and he said, people have come up to him and said, yeah, my parents did talk to me about, the cops, and he was like, yes, that's true. But your parents were telling you how to avoid getting into trouble, and my parents were worrying about would I be potentially shot or killed or roughed up by the cops. But yeah, I come from a rural area as well, as
Albany, Georgia, correct?
Yeah, around those parts, South Georgia. So I think it is slightly different for kids who, grow up in urban or city areas. Like, I certainly got to talk to be respectful to law enforcement, but your contact with police is a little bit different, I think, in rural areas where there just actually aren't like a ton of police officers.
Yeah. Let's talk about Andre Carson now too, and like, this is a little bit longer clip, but it's so rich and it's so kind of touching to hear him talk about it, because I mean, this is a guy who, he talks very vividly about like what happened to him as a young man, and then what came afterwards. So let's listen to that clip now.
Yeah, it was, at a mosque, and another gentleman who was with me, we had an exchange with law enforcement, which wasn't unusual, about kind of just them driving around looking at us. And then the exchange escalated, and the law enforcement, the particular officer, was like, get over here, you in. And I'm like, this was the same year as Rodney King. So the nation had witnessed Rodney King, and for those of us who were used to being stopped randomly and harassed randomly, we're used to it, but to have Rodney King call on tape was a special moment. And to be called out on my name then, I said, whoa. It was, I was only 17, so it was a mixture of fear and, not allowing myself to be disrespected anymore in that moment. And so when I was handcuffed, I was facing the charge of battery on a police officer, resisting arrest, and fleeing. And those charges were dropped. Obviously they were. And at the time, there was a way you could pull up the police report. It's obviously sealed now because I was a juvenile and the laws have changed in Indiana. But even in the police report, the arresting officer talks about, he made note of my manners, how I was courteous, and even considering my pleasantries, that he even noted in his police report, I was still arrested and called out of my name. He noted that I was very respectful, and that came from having been given the talk at home about being respectful to law enforcement, but also knowing as a black man, as a young black male, that I couldn't allow myself to be dehumanized, even when you had a peace officer approached me, and the exchange on my end was certainly respectful, to still maintain the level of respect for authority, but not allow myself to be dehumanized in the process. I have a 13-year-old daughter. I had a recent talk with her the other day, and she's gone to rallies with me. And, because she's a young girl, I think my talk was still very honest, but probably a lot different than what I would have had, if I had a son. And so my talk with her, and she's a different generation. So she has the internet, as opposed to hearing stories from relatives or even friends. You now have these stories in real time, and not only do these stories go viral, but they're available for the global community to see and weigh in on. And so my commentary to her is much different than what was given to me, because she has a lot more access to information. She's getting information kind of in real time, and in a way that my commentary hopefully will help to shape her perceptions about race. And I'm having to have a very honest conversation about who she is as a Black woman. And whenever I can call her smart, intelligent, beautiful, and queen, I say it so much, it probably gets on her nerves. But my hope is that me saying those things to her repeatedly, encouraging her intelligence, encouraging her beauty as a young Black woman, will help against societal pressures that may suggest otherwise.
Carson is this guy who had this experience and then, went into law enforcement himself. I mean, as an officer with the Indiana Department of Homeland Security in counterintelligence. I mean, what was it like talking to him about this? Because he's also, I mean, he has the way that he talks about his daughter is just really, it's just heartbreaking. I mean, to hear that.
Yeah, so he has a very fascinating background, because at age 17, he was arrested outside of a mosque for having this altercation. I think he said he was charged with battery, or resisting arrest, but the charges were dropped, and he was a juvenile at the time. But he would later go on to serve in law enforcement himself. Like you said, he spent over a decade in the police force and DHS. But that fear is so visceral, and to hear him talk about it, and how he tries to counteract this this kind of negative narrative or stereotype about Black Americans, and him worrying about that getting to his daughter. He's so concerned about it. He tries to reinforce these really positive messages to her. And, I asked him, getting the talk and all that you went through as a kid, did that make you feel less than? And, he ruminated on it for a little bit. And he was like, it didn't, because I had this, this knowledge of self. I knew my history, and to be proud of it. And so personally, he pushed back against that narrative, and he wanted to do the same for his daughter.
You talked to these three men. You wanted to talk to some more people too. Not everybody was super excited about going into what's obviously like a very painful, can be a painful memory. But I just want to note here, you got a guy from New Orleans, who went to Morehouse, is, Congressional Black Caucus chairman. You got a guy from Texas, a Republican, intelligence officer, business owner. He's not a super conservative, but he's a fairly conservative guy. Mm-hmm. And San Antonio is, it's a little bit like, Phoenix in my home state of Arizona. I mean, it's not a super racially charged city or town, and yet he had to deal with that. And then, Carson's from Indiana. He's from the Midwest, industrial Midwest, and is a Muslim. And so there's just this breadth of experience and background and experiences of all three of these men, and yet it's so similar. I mean, it's like it's almost like the from a young age, this stuff stays with them. And I mean, I know that you like, as a writer, you like the story to be about your subjects, but I feel
Right.
like, I kind of want to bring this up with you too, because I mean, you mentioned you're from South Georgia. You're a black man, professional, from former congressional staffer, and you've probably dealt with this as well.
I have. It was when I was a congressional staffer. I never really had any run-ins with law enforcement as a kid, but when I moved to DC and I was in my early 20s, I was driving in, Navy Yard before it's this, great big developed area with, Nats Park and all these, bars and Soul Cycles and maybe there's a Lululemon there too. I don't know. But I
There's
was,
the what I like
just
to call the Great Wall of fast casual,
yeah,
with like
yeah,
Rasa and all those all those like cheap fast casual places. Yeah.
yeah. But
Before this.
I was just on my way to get a hamburger, and I get pulled over by the cops and I remembered, my instructions: no sudden movements, hands on the wheel, listen very carefully to their directions. They told me my headlights were out, but I have daytime running lights, so that wasn't true. I can't remember if I had my staff ID visible or whatever, because maybe that signals that I'm not a troublemaker. Not that congressional staffers can be up to no good. But and then they got a call about another vehicle, whatever, and just left me and told me to have a nice day. So I mean, these kind of the pretext for these stops can be pretty thin sometimes, but I was driving a black Chevy Tahoe, black SUV in that neighborhood, so maybe I fit some kind of description of someone they were looking for.
It would be great to play all the full breadth of the interviews, but I think that would probably go on a little bit. But like in your discussions with them on tape and off too, did any of them, whether it was Hurd or Richmond or Carson, give you an idea of this? Something is changing now, with the George Floyd, killing, with the protests, with with Congress considering legislation to reform police governance. Are they holding out hope, or is this just kind of more of the same? What kind of vibe did they give you there?
Yeah. So first, I have to point out just how interesting it was that, I mean, to a man, they mentioned the same set of instructions, and it's not like there is some great guidebook that is passed around that everybody cribs from, but I just found it remarkable that they all said the same thing. But they were all pretty optimistic about the chances now. Several of them noted that the protests this time seem to be more multiracial and multicultural, which is a sign that it has moved into the mainstream. So there could be changes. But that optimism was a bit cautious because, I asked Carson, is your daughter going to have to give this talk to her children potentially? And he says, if she doesn't,
I certainly will.
I will. It's kind of a hedged optimism. I think they think that it's moving in the right direction, but Richmond mentioned out of an abundance of caution, parents will probably still do this. So
I like that term, hedged optimism. Well, Clyde, thank you so much for talking about this story. I think it's it's just a really great look into what it's like to be kind of considering these public policies, right now, to what it's like to be, to have this kind of experience, particularly as a black man in America right now. I really appreciate it. I encourage people to read your story too, and check out the interviews on rollcall.com.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. I just think it's so important that you understand the people who are coming to DC and bringing their entire life's experience into this lawmaking process, so you understand better, where they're coming from.
For sure. Thanks, man.
Thanks, Jason.